There are days that unfold like paper flat, predictable, empty. And then there are days that bend the air around them, days that rearrange the meaning of silence, of presence, of skin. It began like nothing. A Tuesday, a car, a man in a suit, not loud, not late, just early enough to prove, once again, that being black and prepared is still not enough to keep suspicion from knocking. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't lost. He wasn't anything except visible. And somehow, that was already too much. In the next few minutes, 2 officers would approach him. They would speak over him. They would cuff him. And they would not know, could not know that the man they placed in the back of a cruiser would, within 48 hours, sit in judgment over their actions. Because they thought they were arresting a black man in a nice car. What they were doing was putting a state judge in chains. But this story isn't about revenge. It's not about the gavel. It's not even about the video that went viral. This is about power that doesn't shout. Power that sits still, listens, and waits for the world to catch up. This is about dignity in cuffs, and what happens when justice puts on the face of the very system that tried to erase it. So before we begin, if you believe stories like this need to be told, need to be heard, and need to be remembered, tap the like button, share this video with someone who still believes in silent power, and don't forget to subscribe. Because every time you do, this story finds one more person who needs it. Now, let's go back to a rest stop off I-94. 10:06 a.m. Judge Raymond Carter eases his Lincoln into park, and the moment the engine goes still, the system starts moving. It was 10:06 a.m. when Judge Raymond Carter eased his black Lincoln Continental into the gravel-lined rest stop off I-94. The car made no sound but the soft exhale of cooling metal as the engine idled, 40 miles west of Lansing. The trees were still wet with morning dew, the sky a weary gray, and the parking lot mostly empty save for 2 delivery vans and a couple sipping coffee by a red Civic. Raymond shifted the gear into park. He sat still for a moment, both hands resting on the steering wheel like a ritual, not in fear, but in habit. After nearly 6 decades of life and over 20 years on the bench, he'd learned that black still came second to title in the eyes of many, no matter the robe, no matter the resume. He glanced at the leather portfolio beside him. Inside were policy recommendations, handwritten notes on sentencing reform, and a letter from the governor's office inviting him to join a roundtable discussion at noon. That meeting could reshape the justice system statewide, but first coffee and a moment to reset. He exhaled slowly, reached for his phone, opened the navigation, and reviewed the route once more. He was early, the kind of early that came from always preparing for the worst traffic, delays, suspicion. A lifetime of being black in power meant arriving early to prove you belonged. Then came the quiet crunch of tires on gravel behind him. Raymond glanced in the mirror. A white state trooper cruiser had pulled up directly behind his Lincoln. Lights flashing. He frowned, not in panic, but in calculation. A soft tap of muscle memory twitched in his jaw. He lowered the window halfway and kept his posture upright. The thin breeze that entered carried the sterile scent of pavement and pine. The officer approached slowly, one hand on his belt, the other resting near his holster, his face unreadable, eyes sharp. To Raymond, that look was familiar. It wasn't about the car or the license plate. It was that look reserved for black men who didn't look afraid. Raymond spoke first, voice even and calm. "Good morning, officer. Everything all right?" The trooper didn't respond immediately. He scanned Raymond up and down the tailored slate gray suit, the polished leather shoes, the dark skin that didn't match the neighborhood. "We got a report," the officer said flatly, "of a stolen vehicle. Matches this one's description." Raymond blinked once. Not fear, clarity, disbelief. "I'm not aware of such a report," he said. "I'm on my way to Lansing. If you'd like, I can show you my registration." But the officer didn't ask for it. Instead, his right hand moved closer to his weapon. "Step out of the vehicle, now." The words weren't shouted, but they didn't need to be. And just like that, everything Raymond Carter had ever earned, titles, degrees, respect, evaporated into the space between two breaths. Raymond stepped out slowly, deliberately. No sudden movements. His 6'2" frame unfolded from the car like a measured truth calm. Upright, unarmed. The wind ruffled the hem of his suit jacket, and for a moment, it almost looked like a robe, the kind he wore in court, the kind that once made entire rooms stand when he entered. Not here. The trooper motioned him to the back of the Lincoln. Raymond complied, his hands clearly visible, his breath steady. But inside, something ancient stirred. Not rage, not fear, something more patient, more bitter recognition. Another cruiser pulled in. Officer Reich. Younger, shorter, hesitant. She stepped out, adjusting her vest, eyes scanning the scene as if unsure of what she'd walked into. She said nothing. Raymond looked at her briefly, long enough to register the way her eyes avoided his, the way her lips pressed into a line that understood more than she dared admit. "I'd like to know what I'm being accused of," he said. His voice even clipped, unmistakably trained in the rhythm of legal decorum. Neither officer answered. Instead, Jeffers I walked around to the driver's side, yanked open the door, and began rummaging through the glove compartment without a word. Raymond took one step forward. "Officer, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle." That was it. That one sentence, legally correct, calmly delivered, was all it took. Jeffers spun, eyes narrow. "That's obstruction," he barked. "Turn around." Raymond didn't argue. He simply turned. Not in surrender, in strategy. The first cuff clicked cold around his wrist. The second followed, tighter. Reich moved slowly, as if her limbs resisted the command. The metal bit into his skin, but Raymond didn't flinch. His face remained still. Only his eyes flicked sideways, noting the couple by the Civic, now frozen mid-sip. Noting the college student standing beside a silver sedan. Phone lifted. Recording. A silent choir of witnesses. "This is a mistake," Raymond said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Behind the camera lens," the student whispered. "He doesn't look like he stole anything." But the officers weren't listening. They were too deep into the lie now, too locked into the theater of control. Raymond walked toward the cruiser in cuffs, flanked by uniforms. Head high, not in arrogance, in quiet disbelief that even now, even after everything, his skin still shouted louder than his title ever could. He didn't look back at his car. He didn't need to. He had already been here before, not this rest stop, but this moment in courtrooms, in airports, in elevators where strangers clutched their purses just a little tighter. History, for black men like him, had a habit of showing up without warning. The interior of the cruiser was colder than it needed to be. Plastic seats, steel mesh divider, the faint smell of old leather, pepper spray, and sweat. Raymond sat upright, wrists cuffed behind him, the edge of one steel loop pressing against the thin bone just above his watch. Outside the tinted window, the trees blurred, branches, birds, blue sky all streaking past like a scene that didn't belong to him anymore. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He simply watched. Across the rest stop lot, life moved in fragments. The college student was still recording, phone held tight, thumb trembling slightly. A middle-aged white woman stood by a vending machine, her jaw slack, keys dangling motionless in her hand. A black man, likely in his 40s, parked 3 spaces away, had just returned with coffee, and now stood frozen. Cup untouched, eyes tracking the scene with haunted familiarity. On a nearby bench, a retired Army vet, white, thick hands. Vietnam cap leaned forward, elbows on knees. He shook his head slowly and muttered under his breath, "That man doesn't look like someone who stole anything." No one responded. Not his wife. Not the passerby standing near him. Not even himself the second time he repeated it. Because what could they say? What words exist for a truth that's been replaying for centuries? Inside the cruiser, Raymond shifted slightly, his cuffed hands aching now. Still, he didn't show it. He stared ahead as if his gaze could puncture the windshield. Reach beyond the trees, beyond the station waiting at the end of this ride, and into a place where things made sense. He wasn't angry, not yet. What burned inside him was something quieter, something colder, the kind of fire that forged steel, not ash. He was calculating, thinking, measuring, like he had done every time he sentenced a young black boy whose only crime was being in the wrong place at the wrong hour with the wrong skin. Only this time, he was the story, not the judge, not the mentor, not the man behind the bench, just another profile. Just another, maybe it was him. Behind him, Officer Jeffers muttered something to Reich about protocols. She nodded, but her fingers fidgeted. She wouldn't look in the rearview mirror. Raymond noticed. He noticed everything. The drive to the precinct took 14 minutes. 14 minutes in which a man of law became a man of suspicion, in which silence stretched long enough to bruise something sacred. As the cruiser pulled into the lot, Raymond finally looked at his reflection in the glass, the line of his jaw, the gray at his temples, the dark skin that had written laws, mentored clerks, and signed rulings that shaped the state. The face staring back, not a threat, not a statistic, just a man who had forgotten for a moment that even his dignity was conditional. The holding room smelled like ammonia and old sweat, not strong, but persistent, like the kind of staleness that refused to be scrubbed clean. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, unflattering glare on the cracked vinyl chairs and dusty corner where a mop bucket sat forgotten. Raymond Carter, still in his slate-gray suit, sat with his spine straight and his cuffed wrists now resting awkwardly on his lap. The cuffs had been removed minutes earlier, but the thin red welts around his skin lingered like the memory of something unforgivable. No one had looked directly at him since he entered. The booking officer had taken his ID with indifference, typing half-heartedly while chewing gum. No one questioned the name. No one cross-checked the photo. To them, he was just another black man brought in before noon, and that meant the system could afford to be lazy. Behind the glass partition, two junior officers chatted in low voices. One leaned over to peek at Raymond, then leaned back and whispered something that made the other chuckle. The sound echoed more than it should have, like shame bouncing off concrete. Raymond didn't flinch. He sat still, not with resignation, but with discipline. There was a difference. One was surrender. The other was strategy learned from generations who survived by knowing when not to blink. A woman entered, mid-30s, administrative staff. She walked past him briskly, glanced once, eyes skimming over his posture, the shoes, the suit, the calm. Something in her expression faltered just briefly, as if she had registered a contradiction but didn't know how to compute it. Then she looked away. That was the thing about being black in places designed to process you. If you screamed, you were dangerous. If you wept, you were guilty. If you were calm, you were suspicious. He'd seen this too many times from the other side of the bench. It was almost mathematical now. He had asked, respectfully, 3 separate times for access to a phone to notify his office, to inform someone of his absence from a scheduled roundtable with the governor. Each time, he was ignored, redirected, or told. We'll get to that. Injustice didn't always roar. Sometimes it looked like negligence. Sometimes it sounded like silence. Sometimes it came wrapped in polite delay. And so, Raymond sat, silent, shoes polished, cuffs removed but not forgotten, a black man dressed in power but treated like a shadow. And the precinct, in all its dull humming indifference, didn't even realize yet. He was the storm, sitting still. The wall clock ticked toward noon, indifferent to the shifting weight in the room. Jeffers passed by the holding area, again 3rd time in 17 minutes. Each time, his steps slowed just a little more. His arms folded tighter, his jaw more clenched. as if trying to convince himself that his own certainty hadn't just started to crack. Raymond still hadn't spoken, not since the last denied phone request, not since they removed the cuffs without apology. He just sat upright, unshaken, with the kind of posture that didn't belong in that room. That's what made them uneasy, because calm, on a black man, read as defiance, because silence, on a man like him, felt like a mirror. Officer Reich hadn't said a word since the arrest. She kept near the printer, eyes scanning screens, tapping at keys with a kind of frantic casualness. Every few seconds, she glanced up at Raymond, then away again, like she was watching a dog she'd once kicked but now wasn't sure would bite. She saw the marks on his wrists. She saw the papers inside his leather portfolio, partially exposed. She saw the crease of his trousers, the faint shine of courtroom shoes. And still, she did nothing. Guilt, apparently, had no protocol. Jeffers finally stopped at the door, leaned in. "So," he said, his voice edged with mockery, "you going to tell us what you were really doing there? Engine running, no coffee, just sitting, that your routine?" Raymond looked up. His eyes met Jeffers', slow and unblinking. Not anger, not fear, just clarity so sharp it made the room feel smaller. "I was reviewing directions," he said, "on my way to a meeting in Lansing. That's all." Jeffers smirked. "Right. You people always got a story." In that moment, Reich shifted, slightly, but visibly. Her shoulders sagged, her knuckles whitened as she gripped the edge of the desk. She didn't speak, but something behind her eyes fractured. Raymond didn't rise to it. He didn't correct the slur. He didn't raise his voice. He simply turned his gaze from Jeffers to the floor, not in submission, but in restraint. He knew the game. If he snapped, it would justify their report. If he resisted, it would complete their narrative. But if he stayed still, absolutely still, the lie couldn't finish writing itself. So he waited, not passively, but with the focus of a man who had seen too many verdicts fall on the wrong side of history. And around him, the precinct buzzed on, unaware that they were standing in the eye of a storm wrapped in civility. The door at the end of the corridor swung open with a firm push. Footsteps steady, clipped, deliberate, echoed against the tile like punctuation marks. Sergeant Pamela Yates didn't walk like she was used to being interrupted. She walked like someone who knew where she was going before the room even realized she'd arrived. Mid-50s, hair silvering at the temples and pulled tight into a bun. She wore authority like a second uniform. Not loud, not performative, but present. Sharp eyes. A posture that made junior officers shift in their chairs without being told. She scanned the precinct, her gaze moving over each desk, each monitor, each mouth suddenly a little quieter. Then her eyes landed on him. Raymond. She slowed, just slightly. Her boots, still echoing, faltered half a beat. Not because she recognized his face, not yet, but because something in the way he sat didn't fit the room. He wasn't slouched. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't muttering or sighing. He was still, too still. She walked over, stopping just inside the threshold of the holding area. "How long has he been here?" she asked, voice neutral but carrying. "Almost 2 hours," someone offered lazily from behind a desk. "Obstruction. Vehicle matched a report." Yates narrowed her eyes. "Has he been advised of rights given access to counsel?" Raymond answered before anyone else could. "Yes, Sergeant. I've been advised, but I've also requested repeatedly to contact my office. I was scheduled to speak at the governor's roundtable this morning." Her brow lifted. The name hadn't clicked yet, but the tone did. Crisp, controlled, articulated with the kind of precision that doesn't come from panic, but from profession. "What's your name?" she asked. "Raymond Carter." Silence. Not loud, but full. The kind of silence that creeps beneath your collar when you realize you've missed something important. "I strongly suggest," Raymond continued, "someone verify that before this mistake becomes permanent." Behind her, Jeffers snorted. He's been pulling that important man act since we brought him in. Yates didn't turn toward him. Not immediately. She stared at Raymond for another second, then pivoted on her heel and walked briskly toward the nearest terminal, fingers tapping, eyes narrowing. The search bar blinked, waiting. She typed, waited, scrolled, then froze. Her spine straightened. The profile appeared, Raymond L. Carter, presiding judge, 14th District Court, State of Michigan. She blinked, then again, and again. A courtroom photo loaded, the same calm eyes, the same tightly clipped hair, the same voice now echoing back at her from memory. Yates rose slowly, screen still glowing behind her. She turned toward the holding area, toward the man who had said nothing but had let his presence do all the talking. And for the first time that morning, someone in the building felt the weight of what they'd done. Not legally, not procedurally, but morally. Sergeant Yates walked back into the holding room with the screen still glowing in her mind. Her boots struck the tile in an altered cadence, now softer, but more final, like the second half of a verdict being delivered. She didn't say a word at first. She looked at Raymond, seated exactly as before, composed, upright, wrists resting on thighs, the red marks faint but undeniable. He hadn't moved, hadn't changed expression, but the temperature in the room had dropped. Or maybe it was rising. It was hard to tell now. "You said you had a meeting in Lansing," she said. "Yes," Raymond replied, voice steady. "At noon. With the governor. Justice Reform Roundtable." Yates inhaled once deeply. "And you are?" "Judge Raymond Carter." He didn't smile when he said it. There was no triumph in his tone. Only fact. The kind of fact that rearranges a room. Behind her, Jeffers straightened as if pulled upward by invisible string. Reich, halfway between retreat and remorse, turned ghost pale. "Wait, what do you mean, Judge?" Jeffers stammered. Yates turned, slowly, like a tide about to shift. "You arrested a sitting state judge," she said, "without probable cause. You searched his vehicle without a warrant. You denied him his right to contact legal counsel." Her voice was calm, but every syllable was sharpened by protocol and something colder beneath it. Disbelief wrapped in discipline. Jeffers opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He wasn't acting like he didn't say. He didn't have to. Yates cut in. She took a step toward him. Not threatening, but definitive. The kind of step that told a man his story had run out of road. You had his ID. You had a legal duty to verify it. Instead, you escalated without justification. She turned to Reich. "And you. You cuffed him. You assisted. You watched. Did either of you stop to think, for even a moment, what this looked like?" The silence that followed wasn't like before. It wasn't passive, it was reverent. Because they knew. Not just that they'd arrested the wrong man, but that they'd revealed themselves in the process. Raymond stood when Yates gestured, and the room adjusted around his presence like furniture pushed gently aside. She opened the door for him, a door that, 2 hours ago, had closed behind him with metal indifference. "Would you like to contact the governor's office now?" she asked, voice quieter. "Or have someone drive you there?" Raymond gave a small nod, not smug, just tired. "Yes, thank you, Sergeant." As he stepped out of the room, every eye turned not because of his title, but because of the dignity that refused to die in those cuffs. It began as a whisper on TikTok, a grainy 27-second video. Shaky hands, too much wind noise. In the frame, a tall black man in a tailored suit, standing calmly beside a black Lincoln Continental. His hands are raised. Behind him, a white state trooper stands rigid, barking something unintelligible. Another officer steps in, silent, her hands moving slowly, uncertain. Then the cuffs. Click, click. In the background, the student filming mutters, "This is insane. He didn't do anything." The caption read, "Man arrested for being black in a suit. No explanation." Hashtags followed. Warned arrest, stop profiling. Judge Carter. Warned dignity. In cuffs, Wanger racist exposed. By the time Raymond stepped out of the precinct, the video had crossed 50,000 views. By the time he reached the car that would take him to Lansing, it had passed 200,000. By sunset, it hit 2 million. It wasn't just the arrest. It was the silence. The way Raymond didn't resist. The way he stood proud, still, questioning with his presence rather than his volume. On Twitter, a civil rights lawyer quote-tweeted the video with, "This man speaks the language of the courtroom without opening his mouth." And they tried to erase that with cuffs. Facebook threads exploded with familiar refrains. "My brother's been through this. They don't care who you are if you're black. We keep receipts now." Then came the national platforms. News sites ran still images of Raymond being led away. Juxtaposed with his judicial profile, his smile faint, his eyes heavy with the weight of precedent. Anchors paused mid-segment. We now know the man arrested was not only innocent, he was a state judge en route to a meeting with the governor. And still, Raymond hadn't said a word publicly. Because he didn't need to. Because the silence was speaking louder. Back at the precinct, the mood was shifting from tension to fear. Internal Affairs was already making calls. The state attorney general's office requested access to footage. Local news vans circled the parking lot like buzzards sensing something legal and raw. Sergeant Yates stood by her desk, phone pressed to her ear, nodding with tight lips. "Yes, I understand. Yes, we're reviewing everything. Immediately." Reich sat 2 chairs away, staring blankly at the computer screen. She hadn't said much since the moment Yates looked at her with that first flicker of betrayal, not because of what she'd done, but because of what she hadn't stopped. Jeffers paced like a caged animal, barked something about optics, but his voice cracked. Because when a man speaks softly and the whole country listens, you realize power isn't always in the gun or the badge. Sometimes it sits in stillness and lets the world indict itself. The rotunda of the state capitol was unusually quiet. Not the hush of bureaucracy, the hush of anticipation. That sharp, reverent silence that settles over a room just before a reckoning. Reporters lined the hallway outside room 312 clutching notepads, adjusting camera angles, murmuring updates into phones with the urgency of people who knew they were about to witness something that might outlive the news cycle. Inside, aides shuffled papers. Policy advisors scrolled through legal memos, highlighting last-minute talking points about bias training and arrest protocol. But everyone, every voice, every breath was waiting for him. At exactly 10:00 a.m., the double oak doors opened. Raymond Carter entered, flanked by a staff liaison and one quiet officer assigned to escort him. He wore a dark navy suit now, sharper than the one from the morning before. No tie. Collar clean. Portfolio in one hand. Shoulders square. His expression didn't ask for permission. It commanded presence. Every head turned. Every conversation stopped. And then, quietly, not by command but by instinct, people began to stand. Not because they had to, because they understood. The governor, already seated at the far end of the long mahogany table, stood with him, not out of ceremony, but out of necessity. Respect had found its posture. "Judge Carter," he said, voice low, "we're honored to have you here." Raymond nodded once. "Thank you, Governor. I believe the timing speaks for itself." A few chuckled. Most didn't. It wasn't a moment for levity. It was a moment being carved into memory. Before the meeting could begin, Raymond lifted a hand, a small gesture, and the room quieted. "I'd like to speak before we begin," he said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Yesterday morning, I was stopped, detained, and handcuffed by 2 officers of our state police. There was no warrant, no probable cause, only a suspicion not rooted in behavior, but in appearance." His eyes scanned the room not to accuse, but to bear witness. "I'm not the first this has happened to, and unless we act, I will not be the last." He paused. The governor's aide shifted. A young assemblywoman blinked fast and looked down. "We speak often of trust between law enforcement and community," Raymond continued, "but trust without accountability is theater. And dignity, especially the dignity of innocent people, cannot be optional. For a moment, no one moved. Then someone exhaled, and another, a nod, a ripple. This was no longer a policy meeting. It was a courtroom, and Raymond Carter, without robe or bench, had reclaimed his place behind the truth. The corridor leading to the emergency judicial chamber was quiet but not empty. There were too many staffers pretending to check their notes, too many security officers straightening their jackets, too many eyes avoiding his, or worse, lingering too long, like they were watching a story they'd only just realized was real. Raymond walked at a deliberate pace. He carried no papers this time, no briefcase, no security escort, just his silence, polished shoes, and the weight of a truth that had refused to stay behind bars. At the end of the hall, a junior clerk fumbled with the heavy wooden door, then stepped aside with a mumbled, "Good morning, Your Honor." Raymond nodded once, but it was enough. The nod said, "I saw you. I see all of you." Inside, the chamber buzzed with a nervous, bureaucratic rhythm. Legal counsel from the governor's office, senior aides, and 2 additional judges were already seated. Everyone avoided asking the obvious question, should he even be here? But the answer had already been given the night before. After careful review, the legal team had confirmed there was no conflict of interest barring Raymond from presiding over the preliminary review of the arresting officers. No recusal required. No breach of ethics. What there was history. What there was clarity. The officers would be reviewed for misconduct, and the man they had once handcuffed like a thief would now sit above them, robed not in vengeance, but in law. Raymond moved to the center seat of the panel without pause. His black robe hung crisply over his shoulders, heavy not with resentment, but with responsibility. His gaze swept the room steady, unflinching. The door at the rear opened. All heads turned. Jeffers and Reich entered. They didn't walk like officers now. They walked like defendants, shoulders tight, mouths drawn. Jeffers clenched his jaw so hard it twitched. Reich's eyes remained fixed on the floor, as if afraid the walls might speak. Raymond didn't look at them right away. He adjusted the microphone, then spoke. "We are not here to relive public embarrassment," he began. "We are here to evaluate conduct and determine whether the actions taken violated both legal standards and human decency." His voice was calm, unrushed. But no one dared interrupt. Not because of fear, but because when a man walks back into the room where he was once erased and doesn't flinch, the room knows who it now belongs to. The screen flickered once, then steadied. Muted light filled the chamber as the video began to play the same 27 seconds that had raced across phones and news stations, now held in stillness within a courtroom. Jeffers shifted in his seat. Reich kept her hands clenched together, white at the knuckles. There was no sound at first, just the image Raymond in his suit, upright, calm. One officer barking orders, another standing by, expression tight. The camera angle caught the exact moment the cuffs were fastened, and the way Raymond turned his head slightly, not to resist, but to speak. Mouth-forming words the viewer couldn't hear, but the posture said everything. "This is wrong, and I know it." The screen paused on a frame, his wrists bound, his eyes unwavering. Raymond didn't look at the projection. He looked at the officers, then to the panel beside him. "The question," he said slowly, "is not whether I was cooperative. The question is whether they were constitutional." A murmur moved through the chamber like a breeze through stained glass. Next came the body cam footage. Longer. Raw. The moments before the arrest. Uncut. Jeffers' voice recorded saying, "These people always got a story." Reich's silence. The unnecessary search. The refusal of phone access. The way neither officer reviewed the ID. Raymond turned to the state's legal counsel. "Has it been confirmed," he asked, "that my identification was in their possession for over 30 minutes before verification?" "Yes, Your Honor," came the quiet reply, time-stamped and logged. He nodded. "Let that be entered into the record." Then, the statements. Officer Jeffers had written that the vehicle matched the description of a stolen car, but no such report had been filed within 100 miles of the rest stop that morning. When pressed, he said, "I thought I heard something on the scanner. It's common procedure." "And did you report that scanner audio for record?" asked one of the panel judges. "No, sir." Reich was next. Her voice faltered as she answered, I followed my partner's lead. I didn't run the name. I didn't confirm the ID. I should have." Her voice cracked at the end, almost imperceptibly. Raymond leaned forward just slightly, enough that the robe gathered at his shoulders like the slow unfurling of consequence. He didn't raise his voice. Why not? There it was. No accusation. Just the question that didn't let anyone hide behind a form, a policy, or a badge. Reich swallowed, looked at him, looked down. "I don't know," she whispered. "I just didn't expect him to be who he was." And that finally was the truth. Not legal, but cultural. Not procedural, but deep in the bone. They hadn't expected a black man in a suit to be anyone of consequence. And in that assumption, they gave the country its clearest picture yet of what injustice looks like when it's wearing a uniform. Raymond didn't gloat. He simply turned back to the microphone and said, "Let the record reflect the clarity of that expectation." The clock above the chamber door ticked past 5. Outside, daylight had begun to slant, spilling amber light across the marble corridors. But inside, time felt suspended, drawn taut by the weight of everything that had been said, and everything that could no longer be unsaid. The panel of judges leaned inward, murmuring. Pages flipped, notes compared. The state attorney nodded once, then sat back, arms folded with finality. Raymond did not speak during deliberation. He did not look toward Jeffers or Reich. He simply kept his hands folded, eyes lowered to the table, the same way he'd done hundreds of times in his own courtroom, except this time. The law was wearing his skin, and they were the ones squirming under its gaze. At last, the lead panel judge leaned toward the mic. After reviewing all presented evidence, video footage, officer testimony, procedural records, and considering the conduct displayed on the date in question, he paused. The room held its breath. This panel unanimously finds that Officers Jeffers and Reich acted in violation of departmental protocol, constitutional standards, and failed to uphold the basic rights of the individual they detained. A flicker moved across Jeffers's face. Not surprise, but recognition. The kind that comes too late to matter. Reich closed her eyes. The lead judge continued, "It is the recommendation of this panel that both officers be suspended without pay pending a full investigation by the State Attorney General's office, and that an immediate audit of their past 3 years of fieldwork be initiated." The chamber remained still, not a clap, not a murmur. Just silence, deep, unrelenting. The kind of silence that follows after a lie collapses and truth steps over its ruins. Raymond adjusted his mic. His voice, as always, was measured. This ruling is not a punishment. It is a standard, one that should have been upheld before a man had to remind you who he was to earn his dignity. He paused. But make no mistake, dignity should never be conditional. There it was, the closing line. Not a threat, not a flourish, just the last clean note in a room that had already heard too much distortion. Jeffers said nothing. He stared at the grain of the table. Reich nodded once. Slowly, a kind of quiet surrender to the thing she could no longer unsee. Outside, a row of protesters had waited all day, not with signs raised high, but with phones in hand, faces upturned toward the second-floor windows. When the officers exited, escorted in silence, the crowd parted. No shouts, no cheers. Only space. The kind of space carved out by consequence. Raymond remained in the chamber a moment longer, alone now, letting the silence settle. He wasn't thinking about the verdict. He was thinking about what comes after. Because justice, when real, doesn't end with punishment. It begins with the courage to name the wound and the discipline to keep it from reopening. The clip had become legend before the man could even catch his breath. Raymond Carter. Judge Carter had not spoken to a single reporter. No press statement, no op-ed, no exclusive interview in a navy blue suit with an American flag behind him. But still, his face was everywhere. From New York to Oakland, billboards flashed the image. A black man in cuffs, chin raised, expression unreadable. Underneath, in clean white letters, dignity should never be conditional. It wasn't the governor's quote. It wasn't crafted by a campaign team. It was his, from the bench, from a place of measured authority that didn't try to punish, only to clarify. Social media kept spinning. Silent power trended on TikTok. Instagram flooded with side-by-side posts, his judicial portrait beside the still image of his arrest. One artist painted his face in charcoal, overlaying the word power not across his eyes or mouth, but across his hands. Because that's what people remembered. Not just that he didn't resist, but that he never flinched. That he stood there black, dignified, composed, and absorbed the full weight of suspicion without bending under it. And when the cuffs came off, he didn't erupt. He sat down and rewrote the narrative not in fire, but in law. At the state capitol, the chamber that once doubted whether he should be allowed to preside now carried a different energy. Raymond entered quietly, not late, not early, just exact, like always. But the people inside, aides, security, junior legislators, they moved differently now, not afraid, just more aware, like they had finally been taught how to see. Some stood when he entered. Others whispered his name, not loudly, but with reverence. And when the governor rose from his seat and extended a hand, it was not for protocol. It was for atonement. "Judge Carter," the governor said, voice low, "your presence has already done more for this state than any draft legislation we've ever pushed forward." Raymond nodded once, not to dismiss the compliment, but to accept it as weight, not praise. "I'm not here to be a symbol," he replied. "I'm here to ensure this doesn't become another temporary moral panic." And with that, he opened his leather portfolio and sat down at the table. Same place he was supposed to sit the day they pulled him from the side of the road. Same chair that waited while he was locked in a holding room. But now he owned it. Not because of fame, but because he had endured the fire and never raised his voice to prove he deserved air. He declined every interview, every podcast, every network appearance, every "we'd love to tell your story" email written in bold fonts and artificial urgency. They wanted Raymond Carter, the symbol. He gave them Raymond Carter, the worker. The governor's team had drafted a media strategy within 24 hours of the hearing, suggested op-eds, media coaching, national exposure to build momentum. They'd even mocked up a PBS documentary proposal with his name attached. Raymond read it once, closed the folder, and never opened it again. Because for him, the noise wasn't the mission. The mission was what happened when the headlines faded. He spent the next 2 weeks in policy meetings, real ones. No cameras, just sweat and statutes, listening to community leaders, public defenders, grassroots organizers, mothers who'd buried sons without so much as a press conference. In one meeting, a formerly incarcerated man described how officers cuffed him at 13, for running, for being loud, for existing in a hoodie on the wrong block. Raymond didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, "That sound of handcuffs closing, it stays longer than the bruise." The man nodded. In another session, a civil liberties attorney broke down the flaws in use of force reporting. Raymond took notes by hand, every point, every clause, as if he were still a student, because silent power means knowing you never stop learning. Meanwhile, outside those rooms, the world kept painting him into legend. Murals popped up in Detroit, Grand Rapids, and Flint. In one, he was standing in front of a chalkboard, hand raised like a professor. In another, he was seated on the courthouse steps, not speaking, just staring ahead, calm and sharp, like someone who sees the fire but refuses to fan it. At night, Raymond walked home alone, no driver, no escort, just the click of his shoes on the sidewalk and the wind rustling his robe. Sometimes, college students would spot him. They'd whisper, Once, a young woman stopped him at a crosswalk. "Judge Carter," she said breathlessly. "I just want to say thank you." Raymond smiled gently. "Thank you for paying attention." Because that's what this was now, a lesson. Writ large and slow, for a nation that too often forgot to look twice. He wasn't interested in becoming a celebrity. He was interested in ensuring that next time, the cuffs don't close at all. The first department to change was in Ypsilanti, a quiet town, mostly known for its university and cold winters. But their police chief, a black woman who'd watched the Raymond Carter footage more times than she cared to admit, issued a memo. Effective immediately. All officers required to verify ID through dispatch before initiating vehicle search. Mandatory 48-hour suspension for any detainment without warrant or cause. Bias and dignity training no longer optional. Other departments watched. Some rolled their eyes, but others followed. Quietly. Not because of protest, not because of pressure, because what they saw in Raymond Carter wasn't rage, it was structure. When a man like him didn't crumble under humiliation, didn't demand revenge, didn't go viral with a victory lap, but instead showed up in meetings, with notepads and law books and questions that didn't let anyone hide it, forced the system to look at itself. The state attorney general launched an audit of police stops across 5 counties. Subpoenas followed. So did subpoenas for body cam footage. Suddenly, what had once been routine, the pullover, the routine check, the "you people always got a story" no longer sounded benign. They sounded like the beginning of a lawsuit. At the police academy in Lansing, instructors restructured their Week 1 curriculum. Recruits now watched Raymond's video on day 1. Not to shame, to understand. This is what power looks like when it isn't afraid. That's what one instructor said. Even the press began to shift tone, from hero judge humiliated to how silence can dismantle the system more than shouting ever could. And through it all, Raymond kept walking his quiet loop courtroom, conference, back home through side streets and early dusk. He didn't post statements, he didn't publish essays. But wherever he went, rooms rearranged themselves. People stood straighter, chose words more carefully, looked longer into his eyes before speaking, as if trying to gauge if they were being measured. Because they were. And Raymond, he wasn't watching for apologies. He was watching for integrity in the moments when no one thought they'd be watched. That's where real reform lives, not in the spotlight, but in the decisions made after it fades. As one junior officer whispered during a closed-door training, he didn't yell, he didn't threaten, and somehow, he still shook the whole damn building. The academy hall smelled like new uniforms and polished linoleum, a sterile scent that tried too hard to erase history, yet never quite could. 52 recruits sat in clean formation. Crisp collars, shiny boots, the nerves of beginnings. They had spent the morning in firearm drills and traffic stop simulations, then filed into this assembly with no warning except one phrase. "He's coming." They knew the story. They'd watched the footage on their second day of training, an unspoken ritual now. It wasn't presented as tragedy, nor as triumph, just a fact. This happened. It could happen again. And if you're not careful, you'll be the reason it does. At the front of the room, the academy director cleared her throat and stepped aside. Then, he entered. No badge, no applause. Just a tall black man in a dark tailored coat, walking with a stillness so firm that the room seemed to inhale all at once. The only sound was the echo of his shoes on polished floor, not hurried, not slow. Measured. He stepped up to the podium and waited. He didn't adjust the mic. He didn't scan the crowd for effect. He looked forward, steady, as if he'd already seen what this room could become, and was now simply waiting for it to catch up. Then his voice. Low, unrushed, weight without volume. 3 months ago, he began, I was mistaken for a threat. No preamble, no self-praise. Just the truth, dropped into the silence like a stone. I wasn't aggressive. I wasn't armed. I wasn't yelling. I was sitting in my car dressed for a meeting about justice reform. He paused. A few recruits shifted, their breath barely audible. I was cuffed, he continued, by 2 officers who didn't ask enough questions. who didn't stop long enough to wonder who I might be, who didn't see a judge, just a black man alone in a nice car. Still no one moved. Now I'm standing here, he said, not as your enemy, not as a warning, but as a mirror. And with that, Raymond Carter, man, judge, symbol, looked straight into the eyes of 52 future officers and asked nothing of them except this. What will you see when the next man doesn't look afraid of you? Raymond let the silence stretch. He wasn't afraid of pauses, he understood their power. In court, a well-placed pause could reveal more truth than a cross-examination. And here, in this hall full of recruits still learning how to wear a badge, the silence was a test. Could they sit in discomfort long enough to grow? Then he continued. You've been taught the statutes. You've memorized codes. Some of you can already disarm a weapon blindfolded. But none of that will help you the first time you look someone in the eye and realize you don't see a person. You see a threat. He walked out from behind the podium. His steps were soft, but the room followed him like gravity. Training won't fix what you won't admit, he said, and law means nothing when it's weaponized by bias. A young recruit in the second row swallowed hard. His jaw twitched, like someone biting back either a question or shame. Raymond stopped in front of him. Not confrontational, just present. You don't have to be a bad person to make a bad decision. You just have to stop thinking. He turned, pacing gently now. And the problem with power, he said, is that it's very good at convincing you that you're always right. But here's the truth. He faced them again. You will mess up. You will judge too quickly. You will inherit habits from people who smile at you during lunch, but sneer behind the wheel. He let that settle. Some of the recruits looked down. Others stared at him harder, like they wanted to hold on to every word because it didn't sound like preaching. It sounded like truth whispered from someone who had nothing left to prove. Raymond continued, softer now. You'll be taught that command is control. That tone is authority. But dignity. He paused. Dignity is how you carry yourself after you realize you've been wrong. That's what they hadn't taught them in week 1. Not in the tactical room. Not on the mats. But here it was, clear and unshakable, offered by a man who had lived both sides of the badge. You are not here to enforce law, he said finally. You are here to protect belonging. The assembly ended without a standing ovation. No applause, no anthem, just a silence that didn't feel empty, but charged like something had been laid down in the center of the room, too sacred to step over. Raymond gave a polite nod to the academy director and stepped off the small platform. He didn't linger. He never did. His purpose wasn't to be admired. It was to plant something. And what he planted today didn't bloom in flowers. It bloomed in pause, in thought, in changed breath. As the recruits filed out in twos, the room buzzed with motion but no idle chatter. Helmets tucked under arms, boots clicking across tile. A new kind of posture in their backs, like they weren't just leaving a lecture, but walking into something heavier. Raymond headed for the rear door, where the exit opened out into sunlight. Then he heard it. A soft voice, not loud, not urgent, just real. Sir? He turned. A young black recruit stood near the last row, barely 22. Fresh uniform. Still had that new issue stiffness in the shoulders, but his face held something older. Not age, but awareness. He didn't smile. He didn't extend a hand. He just said, thank you. Simple. 2 words. But heavy enough to carry the whole history of what it meant to wear brown skin and a badge at the same time. Raymond held his gaze for a moment. Saw the unspoken things behind those eyes, the hesitation, the hunger, the hope. Then he nodded, deep, deliberate. Go serve with honor. That was it. No sermon, no warning, just a charge. Because this, too, was part of the work, not to change the entire system in one lifetime, but to leave the next person standing a little more upright than you found them. Raymond stepped out into the afternoon. The wind moved through the flagpoles lining the front walk, rattling cords and metal clasps like soft percussion. Behind him, the doors clicked shut, and the sound felt symbolic, not like an ending, but like a covenant being sealed. He stood for a moment at the edge of the stairs, looked out over the wide lawn and the rows of young recruits now dispersing into the real world. He wasn't thinking about the viral video, or the round table, or even the verdicts. He was thinking about seeds, and how slow they grow, and how often they bloom in silence. And in that silence, Judge Raymond Carter smiled, not because everything had changed, but because something had started. It didn't start with a press conference. No podium, no flag, no governor standing beside a grieving family with a hand placed too awkwardly on a shoulder. It started with a spreadsheet, 3 columns wide, names, badge numbers, dates. In a windowless room inside the Michigan Department of Public Safety, an analyst mid-30s, white, tired, stared at the data long enough for patterns to emerge like bruises under the skin. Jeffers, Reich, and 19 others flagged for discretionary stops disproportionately targeting black drivers. It was subtle, the way these cases repeated no dashcam, no record of radio requests, vague language in the report's suspicious activity, non-compliant tone, matched a description. But the pattern was there, and now they had a reason to look. The Carter case, that's what they were calling it now, in closed-door meetings, legal memos, and city council briefings whispered over bad coffee. But Raymond had never asked for a nameplate. He didn't want this to be about one story. He wanted it to be about the rot. And the rot, as it turned out, had roots. 3 precincts launched internal reviews. 5 more followed. Lawyers began reopening cases tied to officers whose reports now read like fiction under the glare of post-Carter scrutiny. And each time a department head tried to stall, someone would whisper, "You saw the hearing, didn't you? You want to end up on the other side of his gaze." Because that was the shift. Raymond hadn't just changed the narrative, he had changed the fear. Before, it had been fear of being caught on camera. Now, it was fear of being weighed and found lacking by a man who never raised his voice. Meanwhile, the recruits he'd spoken to were now in ride-alongs, field training, their boots still new, their instincts still forming, and quietly. A few of them had started asking more questions during stops, requesting supervisors earlier, saying sir and ma'am not out of fear, but out of intention. It wasn't revolution, not yet, but it was movement. And sometimes, movement is enough to crack concrete. Raymond never asked for updates. He didn't chase progress reports or schedule interviews. But the Attorney General sent him a private memo one evening. "Your presence redefined procedural integrity in this state." Raymond read it once, folded it carefully, slipped it into a drawer already filled with letters like it untouched but never discarded. Because he knew the moment you start believing your own press, you stop listening to the room. And Judge Carter, he was still listening. Always. The courtroom looked the same. Same beige walls, same wooden benches worn smooth by time and tension, same brass scales affixed above the judge's bench symbolizing balance. Though Raymond had long since learned balance was not the same as fairness. But the silence, that was new. It followed him now, not the awkward hush of disbelief, like when he first entered after the arrest, but a deliberate stillness, a quiet that bent slightly in his direction. Not reverence, not fear. Awareness. He stepped behind the bench. A bailiff adjusted his posture. A clerk whispered less audibly. Even the stenographer, seasoned, unfazed by chaos, paused her fingering for half a second longer when his robe moved. Raymond sat. He scanned the docket. 2 arraignments, a probation review, a civil dispute over fencing and property lines. Nothing historic, nothing viral, just law on a Tuesday. But the people in the room, they were watching differently now. A defense attorney, white, mid-40s, graying at the temples, glanced up with a flash of discomfort, as if suddenly aware of every time he'd interrupted a black client. A young assistant prosecutor fumbled her notes, not because she was unprepared, but because consciousness had finally arrived, and with it, the memory of silence she had once found comfortable. The first case began. A black teenager, 17, charged with obstruction during a traffic stop. Raymond read the report twice, then asked calmly, "Why was he pulled over?" The prosecutor gave the standard response. He matched the description. Raymond didn't nod, didn't blink. He just asked, "Description of what exactly?" The courtroom shifted. Words like that didn't sound explosive on the page, but spoken in his voice. They unraveled lazy logic like thread coming undone. The prosecutor hesitated. Male, dark hoodie, near a 7-Eleven. Raymond's eyes narrowed, not in anger, but with surgical intent. And what made the officer escalate to a physical takedown? The attorney shuffled, then looked at his notes like they might rewrite themselves. Non-compliance. Raymond looked up. Define it. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of footage, of headlines, of cuffs. He dismissed the charge. Not out of charity. Out of principle. The gavel hit wood not like thunder, but like a pulse stabilizing. Something returned to order, not the system, but the soul inside it. And when the courtroom emptied, no one lingered to shake his hand. They walked slower, straighter. Because Judge Carter didn't make them feel safe. He made them feel seen. The sun was leaning west when Raymond stepped down from the bench. The docket was done. The files were signed. The courtroom was empty, save for the scent of legal paper and the lingering warmth of bodies that had come in heavy and left a little lighter. He didn't hurry to leave. There was something sacred in the after-stillness of court, that brief, breathless pause after judgment has landed, but before the world starts moving again. He stood by the window. Outside, a mother guided her son across the courthouse steps. He couldn't have been more than 10. His backpack hung crooked, and he kept glancing back through the glass, not at the building, but at Raymond. Their eyes met. The boy didn't smile, but he stared in that wide-eyed way children do when they recognize something larger than the moment. Something that says, "This place once told people like me to lower our heads. Now it looks me in the eye." Raymond gave a subtle nod, and the boy turned away, as if that alone had been enough. Inside, the clerk was still typing. The air conditioning whispered overhead, but beneath it all was something else. A recalibration. Not just in protocol, in posture, in perception. Raymond didn't need to tell the staff to rethink their tone. He didn't need to remind them to verify ID, to listen longer, to file more precise reports. They were already doing it. Not because he demanded it, but because his presence had made them feel watched, not surveilled, but accountable. Accountable in the way that shifts from fear into practice. From compliance into care. He gathered his robe, folded it neatly, placed it in his satchel. The fabric still held the echo of that chamber where he'd read out the verdict. It wasn't heavy, but it wasn't light either. As he stepped into the hallway, a janitor, an older man, black, skin like worn cedar, looked up from mopping. "Welcome back, Judge," he said, with a half-smile. Raymond paused, nodded. "Feels different in here now," the man added. Raymond didn't answer right away. He looked down the long hall, its fluorescent hum, its white walls unchanged in appearance, but altered in gravity. "Maybe it always could have," he said softly. "It just needed someone to stay long enough to make it notice itself." The janitor chuckled, shook his head. "You talk like a preacher, but you judge like a surgeon." And with that, he went back to mopping. Raymond walked on. The floor behind him glistened, not clean, just honest. Spring arrived like it had something to prove. The trees lining the Michigan Law Enforcement Training Academy were in bloom, blushing with soft pinks and stubborn greens, reaching out in delicate defiance of what the last season had done to them. The wind had shed its frost, now moving gentle and warm across the stone steps and metal flagpoles, jangling ropes like faint bells calling for attention. Raymond Carter stood at the bottom of those steps, coat buttoned against the breeze, leather folder in one hand, the other tucked loosely into his pocket. It had been 3 months. 3 months since the cuffs. 3 months since the verdict. 3 months since the silence he'd carried became the sound a whole state started listening to. He had turned down speaking engagements in 6 cities, skipped a panel on judicial ethics, declined an award that bore his name before he even had a chance to grow old enough to forget the moment they tried to take his dignity. But this invitation was different. This wasn't about appearances or applause. This was about beginnings. 52 recruits stood in crisp formation at the far end of the courtyard, fresh uniforms, boots lined straight, eyes forward, a few faces too young to know what they were about to carry. Others older, perhaps already touched by things they didn't know how to name. This was the first graduating class under the new state mandate, a class trained not only in defensive holds and traffic procedure, but in constitutional literacy, racial bias recognition, de-escalation rooted in human dignity. The Carter standards. Some had begun calling them quietly, unofficially. Raymond didn't like the name. He hadn't written the reforms for legacy. He had simply made it impossible to pretend they weren't necessary. The academy director met him at the steps. "Judge Carter," she said warmly, "we're honored." He nodded. "I'm just here to see if what we started can hold." She smiled, a little sad, a little proud. "It's holding." Raymond climbed the steps slowly, with the rhythm of someone who wasn't returning to a scene, but checking on a seed. As he approached the podium, the recruits straightened. A few swallowed hard. 1 or 2 stiffened, as if bracing for something more powerful than a lecture. Raymond adjusted the mic just slightly. Then he looked out at the rows of faces and said, simply, "I'm not here to speak to your training. I'm here to speak to your sight." And the wind, respectful, quiet, stilled, like even nature wanted to listen. "You've learned how to stand," Raymond said, voice even, low. "Now you must learn how to see." No one moved. The air around the recruits thickened not with fear, but with focus. "You'll be told to scan for weapons, for hand movements, for quick glances and slow retreats, and those things matter. But there's something they haven't written into your manuals." He let the pause stretch. "You'll also need to learn how to see someone who looks like me and not assume danger. You'll need to see a hoodie, a beard, a low voice, and not confuse them with threat." One cadet, somewhere near the back, shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if those words had found the place where discomfort lives. Raymond noticed. Of course he did. "But I'm not here to shame you," he said. "That's too easy. I'm here because this job, your job, has the power to protect something sacred. Not just law, but dignity." He stepped out from behind the podium, walked slowly, quietly, across the front of the rows. "And the hardest part," he continued, "it won't be in the streets. It'll be in the room after, when your partner says something off, and you choose whether to speak or stay silent. It'll be in the report you write, when the story doesn't quite match the truth. It'll be in the moments where no one sees you." He stopped, looked at them all. "But you still have a choice." A breeze picked up, soft but certain, as if affirming the weight of his words. "I don't want you to remember me as the man in the video," he said. "I want you to remember what wasn't in the video the moment I asked to explain myself, and no one listened. The moment I showed ID, and it was ignored. The moment I was calm, and it made them more suspicious." He let that linger. Then, don't be the reason someone stops believing that justice is real. And in the silence that followed, something shifted. Not applause, not emotion, something quieter, something settling. Then, from the third row near the end of the formation, a young black cadet raised his chin. He didn't speak, didn't move, but his gaze locked on Raymond's, clear and unwavering. A silent nod. Not of admiration, not of pity, but of recognition. Raymond held that look for just a moment longer than required, then nodded back. 2 men, 2 generations, 2 uniforms, 1 silent understanding. We carry this together. The ceremony ended as it had begun, with quiet precision. No music played, no dramatic announcement. The director stepped forward and gave the closing salute. The cadets, now officers, stood straight as the flags fluttered overhead. Raymond stepped down from the podium, his coat brushing lightly against the stone as he descended. No one reached for him. No one tried to hold him back. But everyone watched. Because when someone speaks with that kind of clarity, the kind born not from rage, but from restraint, you don't just hear them. You remember them. Raymond made his way across the courtyard, past the rows of stone benches and trimmed hedges, past the statue of blindfolded justice that stood too tall for its own metaphor. He didn't look back. Not because he was finished, but because what he came to do didn't require confirmation. The new officers peeled away slowly. Some headed toward their waiting families. Others stood in small circles, whispering thoughts they didn't yet have words for. Near the side gate, the same young black cadet from earlier paused, looked over once more. Raymond didn't raise a hand. He didn't need to. The nod had been given. The work, at least this part of it, had been passed on. He stepped out onto the sidewalk. The sun was dipping low now, casting long shadows across the pavement. The city moved on in the distance, cars honking, lives rushing. But in this space, time seemed to exhale. Light bounced off windshields, off metal railings, off the curve of the academy's entrance sign. For a moment, Raymond stood still. He wasn't thinking about the arrest, not about the cuffs, not about the cold plastic of the holding cell, or the viral video, or the gavel in his hand the day he read out that verdict. He was thinking about all the quiet decisions people make when no one's watching. To pull over or not, to speak up or stay silent, to believe someone or doubt them, just because of what they look like. Those were the choices that built a system, and if made differently, they could rebuild it too. Raymond stepped forward. Not fast, not slow. Just forward. The world didn't cheer. But somewhere in a precinct, in a courtroom, in a future that now had one more chance, something shifted. And that was enough. Because sometimes, the strongest stand isn't the loudest. It's the one taken with calm, clarity, and courage so that others may rise where silence once buried them. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.